what it means to be accountable is something that's actually changing, right? It used to be that people held each other accountable in certain ways under certain conditions. But I can give you one quick thing, is that I was talking to somebody who did used to work on Capitol Hill, and I asked, just randomly one day, what do you think happened around 2001? Why did the Congress become so polarized? And his answer was, the internet. And I said, the internet? He said, sure, it was the internet, right? What happened was that all of a sudden, any congressperson's vote was immediately apparent and knowable by their most extreme constituents, right? Right or left, doesn't matter. But the vote was actually immediately known. And so the most extreme constituents who cared the most about issues could actually magnify their voice because of all these networks and connectivity, right? And they could put pressure back on the congressperson by saying, hey, you got to fix that voting thing or we're going to run you out of office and vote somebody else in, which is a great American right to do, right? To vote. The problem with this is that it actually polarized Congress because it actually holds, this is his story, it holds those Congress people accountable for every little vote, but the system was designed for compromise. The system was explicitly designed to enable compromise so that a congressperson could actually trade off a local optimization for a more global optimization. And if you take away that ability to compromise, you kind of break the system. Right? It's a fair argument. I think it's interesting. What can you do about it? Oh, nothing. Can't be anything. Can't do anything about it. Like, well, that's not a very good answer, right? But we have to figure that out, right? He doesn't have an answer. This isn't a happy ending. There is no answer. I don't know what the answer is to that. But it changes what it means to be accountable. You see it happening across the board. You see it happening in things like the stuff that happened in Indiana with the law on discrimination and gay rights. You see people holding folks accountable in ways that only the networking and only connectivity can actually allow. You see also things happening around publishing, for example, and we're going to talk about this one as well just briefly. In the notion of publishing, it used to be that a publisher had a real role, right? And publishing organizations are going to say, I still have a real role, but it's been diminished, right? Anybody can publish anything now, anytime, and anyone can actually get access to anything that's published. Right? And so what happens is the burden on the reader increases tremendously. Publishing houses used to, right, sort of adjudicate things that were published and said, if a particular press actually published a particular thing, then you had a sense that, okay, maybe there's something here that I should pay attention to. As opposed to, if I just publish something and release it on the net, then there's a burden on the reader to understand what it is that's being said and to adjudicate its value, right? If the impact on this, for example, would be, I will argue, say, the Lancet article that was subsequently retracted, right? But the Lancet article that linked vaccines to autism, right? This was a peer-reviewed publication, the Lancet, very respected. Everybody has access to this. See, I told you I was right all along. Turns out the guy was wrong. It was retracted. Now, it turns out that scientists know what to do with that. Right? They know that when something's retracted, they take it and they sort of separate it out of their head and they don't think about it anymore. But it turns out a lot of other people don't. And then they don't trust the institution, and then they think the institution is wrong, and they think they're actually trying to hide something. And now what you have is a morass, right? And I'm firmly in the camp of the Danes who actually looked at all the data and said that there is no link. So I'm going to go with that science right there, and I'm going to argue that it's very difficult to get out of this situation right now, right? Because of the way connectivity specifically has enabled everybody to have a conversation about everything, right? And the result is that diseases that we thought had mostly gone are coming back, and for people who are old enough to actually remember those diseases, they're not fun. They're just not fun, right? So this is real impact. It has real impact on our society and how we live. Fundamentally, what we're doing is moving from prolonged periods of relative stability with punctuated volatility to prolonged periods of relative volatility with punctuated stability, right? We think that's what's going on. We think that's the fundamental underlying shift in the Digicene. And if that's the case, then it changes the way we think about our business tools, our marketing tools, and our strategy tools. Those are networks, right? Then we want to think about what are the strategy tools that we want to actually get through, a couple of them that we've been using to think about how do we imagine that we can operate within and through a network. And so one of the things that was in that video of thinking about open data, we did our social science work, right? And we figured out some patterns. And we think one of the patterns that we figured out was that there was a notion of having personal data, of people starting to recognize that their data is theirs and that there was this notion of personal data. There were people doing research on this. We saw people like Helen Nissenbaum at the NYU who are looking at data and privacy not so much as being withheld and in a vault, but so much more as being the controlled circulation of data within a context, right? And so we started thinking about people and what it would be like if they could actually manage their own data and have access to their data, right? Maybe you wouldn't own all of it. Maybe you would be shared ownership. So if you actually, did something online with another company, they would have your data, but you might also, right? And you would be the only one, though, in the end that had all of your data that would be to you, right? So you could theoretically do stuff with it. You could monetize it. You could bring algorithms in and run against it. You could have algorithms come in and run against your data compared to others. There were things you could do about that. The challenge that we faced, of course, was that everything is actually built around the reverse right now, right? Everything's based on certain other people who know how to use data, right? Other companies being able to actually aggregate and keep those data and keep them to themselves and actually use that as a competitive asset, right? So we thought it would be better for the company, it would be better for Intel, think it would be better for the economy and the world if people had more access to their own data and could participate in the economy in a greater way. And we could talk about that later, but that's where it is. So it's more like this, where the data is actually working with you and for you and on your behalf, as opposed to matrixy thing, right, which is just data everywhere, right? And the questions that we had to ask, and these are the questions that we actually asked. We're very happy with the first 7. We're not so sure about the last one yet, and we'll make these available to you later if you wish. But we think about strategy then as system transformation. If we're thinking about systems that exist and those systems are in constant movement anyway, we should think about strategy as ways of actually impacting a system and changing it, right? Of pushing it along in some way. And so we asked these questions. This is what social science helps us to do as well. So we thought, well, the system we wanted to create was something around personal data. The participants were actually regular people. Data counts as a resource, but so do things like thinking about what data means, understanding how to actually think about data. All the things that I said were really hard. These are things that count as resources. And then start thinking about the practices. We always think about where power is in the system, right? And then we think about how systems change. From our point of view, it's based on the fact that the social science actually was able to tell us, or we think that it was able to tell us, that we think something called personal data is something that's real, that's something that if we were to push it in the right direction, that it would be something that would be of value to people, and therefore what are the technologies that would enable that to happen. The first thing we did is we went out to a whole bunch of people, a couple hundred folks, and we said, hey, there's this personal data thing. What would it take to do this? What's important for having an ecosystem like that, right? And people gave us back all of these different things that you need to have data literacy and stored data and availability of data and all this kind of stuff, right? We boiled them down to 90 that we thought were reasonable, right? Not overlapping with each other. We boiled them down to 90. There were 300 to start with, and there were a lot of overlapping ones. This means the same as that, so they combined. And then we asked 50 experts, right? People who knew about data, knew about sort of the notion of open data a little bit. We asked 50 of them to go through and to rate all 90 against all 90. It was a very long and hard task, right? And to say, does this attribute positively or negatively influence this other attribute? If so, in what direction, positively or negatively? And how strongly does it influence? So for 90 things, they had to go through and rank against 89 other things, right? So it's a long, hard, tedious task. But in the end, right, what you have is certain clusterings. We know that they clustered into certain goals, and I'm going to, We know they clustered into certain goals that you can see here on the left: value, derived, action, collaboration. For the blue and purple, look to the back, right? And then we can get this network, and this is just like a big hairball of a network, right? There's a lot of nodes, and they're all connected to one another. And the question is, what do you do with this, right? And if I walk you through here, you can start looking at the nodes. You can look at their connectivity. What are the most connected nodes, and what are the least connected nodes? And you can look at path length. What's the length it takes, the number of hops it takes to get all the way through the network, right? And that tells you something. Not uninteresting, but it tells you something. And you can look at a couple of examples of what a highly connected node is. So it turns out this one, sort of having a marketplace for data analytics, is a highly connected node. There's a lot of things that it influences, a lot of other nodes, and there's a lot of nodes that it is influenced by, right? And if you're looking for a catalyst, it turns out that's a hard one, because a lot of things are influencing it, and a lot of things are influenced by it, right? What we preferred to look at was link asymmetry in this case, right? And what we wanted to look at were things like this, right? Tools for anonymizing your personal data, because that one influences a lot of other nodes, but it's actually only influenced by very few, right? And if you go through the network and you do the math on that, right, what you end up with is a set of 22, I think, right? You get a set of 22 nodes that are highly asymmetrical, right? And those highly asymmetrical nodes then form into a little cluster because we know the goals they're associated with, and they formed into 4 different clusters, and then we can actually go through and just make those 4, right? And say that these are the 4 catalytic areas that we think are necessary to work on if we want to push forward in a personal data kind of economy way, right? One of them is this notion of data literacy. Oh, that's why it's going. One of them is the notion of data literacy. Where was that? Here, which we've mentioned before. It's this, how do you actually work with data? And what does it mean to do that, right? What are the design implications for doing that, right? People aren't going to go home and actually open up their data dashboard and see what's going on. They're not going to do that, right? But there are ways to actually design the use of data into the systems that they're actually using on a daily basis to actually allow that to occur, right? There's clearly a bunch of access issues, right, that need to be addressed here, and there's specific ones underneath each of these nodes. There's this notion of digital trust, of trusting, that has to actually occur, and we know that there's been some breaches of trust along the way in the industry as a whole that make that a difficult thing to do. And then finally, there's this sort of notion of platform openness, right? The ability to actually move data from point to point or to have algorithms. Now, what we think about this is that these are catalytic probes, right? We think these are the places to do work to enter into that large ecosystem of personal data that I showed you before, and to say, what companies are working on these kinds of things, right? That narrows that possibility space way down. What companies should we be encouraging to work on more of these kinds of things? What should we be working on to encourage the industry, or what can we be working on uniquely to encourage the industry to move in that particular direction as a result of knowing these kinds of catalytic probes, right? And again, all of this is based on the fact that there's this massive connectivity, that all of this stuff is data, and that data actually occurs. And so our argument is that if we use more tools like this, and we use different kinds of measures, like measures of centrality, measures of catalysis, measures of strategic influence, measures of control point, right, throughout a wide possibility space, we can very quickly sort of narrow in where we need to start doing some experiments to look for those emergent properties that actually occur in the system. We ended up sponsoring the first National Day of Civic Hacking. This was the Obama administration wanted to open up a bunch of national databases, and they were going to have this National Day of Civic Hacking, and there were 11,000 hackers, and they were in, I think, all 50 states and a variety of cities, and they came together, and by sponsoring it for relatively little money, what we were able to do is to actually tailor the exercises to those 4 catalytic points. Right? So we could say, look, I want you to work in one of these 4 areas, but other than that, have at it. Just do whatever you want. Eat a lot of pizza and enjoy your day. And what they were able to do and what we were able to do rather was actually by doing all of that, we ended up finding 6 companies that we ran through a little accelerator that we ran at the company, right? That were zeroed in on these kinds of issues that we talked about before: data literacy, trust, platform openness, and digital and access, right? So again, we were able to, because of the way we're thinking about the possibility space and because of the questions we're asking, we're able to go from 769 to a few, from 90 items, right, interconnecting in all kinds of ways, to a few, to 4, right, catalytic points and 22 nodes, right, from 11,000 hackers coming up with all kinds of business ideas to a relative few that we think are interesting for what it is we were trying to do, right, and so this was all done under the aegis of the Intel Labs and the research, and so we were able to sort of point, and we are making decisions and taking actions in this particular industry with respect to the company as a result of doing some of this.